Okay, so how we decided to do this, we kind of scrapped a moderator, and the questions that we're going to answer, which we tweeted out earlier, will be on the screen behind us, and we'll kind of just go through it that way. Then at the end, we'll open it up for further questions from all of you. This is very daunting to be sitting down here. So we'll start with intros, beyond what Phil gave us, and kind of give some background. Specifically, we're talking about library IT, and that can be defined very differently from from anybody. They might see library IT and integrated IT as being something totally different from how I see it, and so that's kind of, we'll start off with what our own personal definition of it is, or what integrated IT is. And for me, integrated IT is basically folk who have been given assigned to learn and understand and support technology specifically associated with the library. So you might have central IT that you go to for email server support. You may have, and they also may have folk that are assigned to working with the library specifically. I've worked in library settings, both where there is the library and central IT, and if there's a problem, somebody in the library will go to central IT. I've also worked in libraries where there's central IT, library IT, and libraries, and if there are problems with library systems, they go to the library IT, and it will escalate beyond that if they can't fix it. I've also worked in libraries where there's been central IT and libraries, and they're working to merge the two together, where central IT physically is moving into the library to support the continued responsibility of central IT, but also to gain a stronger responsibility and familiarity with the library systems as we've gained speed in the technology that we are using and how we're using it, and how students are using it specifically in the academic setting. So that's what my background is in regards to our topic.
I was so nervous about my part, I heard nothing of that. Just in case I repeat anything, I'm like, wait, my turn? So I've actually not worked in IT. I've run a lot of technology adjacent projects. I have worked in sort of the techie areas. So I think my comments are sort of from kind of an outsider perspective based on conversations and what I'm observing kind of at the institutional, consortial, national level around library technology. And I think I was the one that kind of pushed for the definition question, because I was like, what are we talking about when we say library IT?
I think that was your exact words.
My sense is that the scope and the complexity of the work has increased enormously, but it's still a little bit of a black box from outside it. We sort of say, call it IT, but that's everything from hardware to web services to all of the things, and I don't know that we have a really good handle, and we collectively, especially those who aren't in it, so I feel like my ignorance is a bit illustrative here. So I don't know that we have adjusted to what that means. I have seen, in my experience in a couple of different libraries, seen IT kind of spread out through the organization. It seems to often be led by sort of the web front end. So you'll see sort of web committees, web teams that aren't necessarily completely within IT. And some of the Skull Comms work, of course, is going out there. But I don't know if we're talking about integrated, that, and we're going to get into that a little bit more, is we're there yet.
Okay, I still have no voice. So I'm relatively new to this whole kind of management thing. I'm wearing two hats right now. I'm a web services librarian. That's my primary job, which I'm now doing half-time, while I am also the head of library IT services. So I am starting to think about these things in a new way, because I'm not only part of the department, I'm now trying to lead the department. So I don't know if I really have an answer. I've got a lot of questions. I come from a bit of a complicated scenario presently. My department is about half the size that it normally is right now. Not because we have open positions, but we are missing individuals. in our department. And I presently have no system administrators to actually run a lot of the things that we're doing. So I'm starting to think about integrated IT and trying to figure out the role of partnership within integrated IT. Never take the chance to get something good out of a good crisis, which is what we're kind of in right now. And we're using this crisis to build our relationships with our campus IT. And so we're looking at leaning on them a little more in the short term for things like some system administrator help. But we're also looking at other ways that maybe we can leverage their larger system and their larger staff. So, for example, one of the things we're looking at is using campus IT to help us with our backups. So we're looking at partnerships, and I think we're still trying to figure out how much we're willing to give away and how much we need to keep in our own department. So again, lots of questions. And like Gillian said, the scope is really, I think, expanding more than anything. We're seeing digital scholarship exploding in a new way, digital humanities, digital preservation, digitization, digital scholarship, data preservation, et cetera. So I think we are grappling with what IT actually really means nowadays, because we are seeing a lot of people who aren't necessarily full-on techie getting more involved in what we might originally have called the techie sphere.
So my route to sort of systems librarianship might be the most traditional of the three of us. After library school, I did a little bit of liaison work, but then pretty quickly became technology librarian at University of Ottawa, and then a systems librarian at U of A. So that's been pretty much my whole career has been in this area. And for the first little while, I think I kind of kept my head down and worked on nuts and bolts things. I worked on our DSpace implementation. I worked on a discovery implementation at U of O. But then over the last couple of years, I've started thinking more and more about these questions of IT culture, library culture, and academic culture. And when Whitni first proposed the idea for the panel, one of the things that she had said was, from her perspective, one of the interesting questions was the difference in culture between a library IT and non-IT, if you want to put it that way, parts of the library. And I think I pushed back a little bit on that definition as well. What is library culture? How does IT fit within all of that? So I come from, University of Alberta is quite large in the Canadian context. We have a large systems department, probably larger than even our FTE really demands. We have always managed all of our own infrastructure, so servers, network switches, everything down to the bottom. We used to have that all stored, actually physically located within the library, but over the last few years we've started to rely more on campus IT to store things for us. So we still have all our own access, we still have complete control over our servers, but they're stored in protected data centers run by campus IT. So it's been a bit tricky managing that relationship over the last little while, because there's sort of been attempts at growth or takeover by campus IT that we've had to resist, along with some of the larger departments on campus. But also questions around where is the dividing line. So campus IT runs our printing, for example. And what does that look like to the non-IT departments of the library? How do they understand where the distinction is between campus IT and their own library IT? How do we manage those relationships? And how do we situate ourselves, both how do we situate ourselves within library projects, and how do we make sure that we bring the rest of the library along with projects that we are putting forward? So those are some of the questions that I have.
First question, sorry, I don't have it in front of me. How can a library IT department balance its own projects with supporting library initiatives and library services?
So I'm going to take the lead on that one. One of the interesting questions for me started out in talking with our metadata team. From their perspective, metadata work was often left off of library projects when they were being dreamed up. If they were dreamed up within IT, sometimes we would forget that, yes, of course, there's metadata work that's going to have to go along with it. If it was dreamed up in public services, for example, or in an information literacy department, they may be unaware of the technical and metadata requirements completely. So one of the things that we've often talked about is how do we make sure that metadata, for example, is on the table, everyone remembers that they're there and remembers that they need to be included. IT so far has had less of a challenge with that, I think because at my place of work anyway, everyone it took a while, but everybody does recognize that you're going to have some kind of technical infrastructure. You're going to have a web page, or you're going to have some kind of a display, or you're going to have an email system set up. So IT tends to get on board with that. And of course, so we end up supporting a lot of the projects that are driven by public services or cataloging or information literacy. And so we sit as a support unit for all of that. If something goes wrong, they open a trouble ticket with us, we scramble to fix it. But on the other hand, we're a unit of the library as well, with our own interests and our own priorities and our own projects. So how do we develop an IR, right? That comes up out of the IT department. How do we develop a new discovery system? And how do we make sure that, conversely, we're including people, especially people in public services, people on the front line, when we're thinking about requirements for those projects. One of the things that comes up a lot, I hear a lot in conversations with people all over the library, is the question of translation. That one of the things that library staff tends to be really good at, either because they're born that way or because this is the work we're all doing, is translating between very nitty-gritty technical things when you're talking to a system administrator, for example, and more high-level conceptual or service-oriented things when you're talking to public service. And that's where I think library IT fits. But the question for me is how do we balance that? How do we staff both of those things? How do we prioritize between our own projects and support? I think there are methodologies out there to help us, but I think those are things that we're currently working through. So you don't have to answer the question.
I'm not planning to. I have many of the same questions that Sam has, and it's something that we're struggling with. And I think the presentation this morning by UNB kind of encapsulate. Oh, I can't even talk. It summarizes what this question is. I'm not even going to try. So the big question for me is, how do you balance those projects? I can't remember the last time a project came out of my department and wasn't a response to a request from somewhere else, because we are constantly putting out fires. And I want my staff to be able to have the time to explore their own interests, and I presently can't. They're just putting out fires. So how do we do these new projects and balance all of the projects from the library to the department level if we're understaffed? And this is where I think those expectations become essential. Transparency becomes essential. So I think there was talk, UNB talked about implementing a ticketing system. So one of the things we're looking at is opening up our ticketing system so that everybody can see it. So they know that, yes, we know it's there, but there are 10 other things in front of you. So maybe don't call us every 5 minutes. So I think if we make those expectations and priorities very transparent, we can help balance that, put out the fires, the needs of other departments, and then building our own projects within our own division. And I think I can say we're still striving to get there. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
I've been struggling sort of with this question because, I think the presentation this morning, we talked about guides on the side. I think we live in an environment where IT is on the side. It's not as well, although technology is primarily what libraries do now, in my opinion, we don't treat it as such. We treat it as sort of a support unit that's underneath us, not beside us, not within our work, those of us outside of technology. And that's best viewed when you see the kind of dual role that IT departments now are doing, as Sam was saying. You know, there's the basic, make sure everybody has the infrastructure they need to do their job. And that's sort of that support role, the very traditional IT role, make sure everything is up and running. But I'm also seeing a lot of action, both in response to other departments and things that IT is actually generating out in kind of that specialist way that isn't so distracting. And I've totally lost my train of thought. But that's a really difficult balance to strike, is supporting the needs of faculty and staff when you're at an academic institution. So we get a lot of requests from outside the library for IT support and metadata support and other supports. Supporting your own people within the library, as well as sort of driving a strategic agenda around technology when you're only on the side. So I think I have some really big questions about the role of IT generally, and I think what we're seeing is that conflict between the projects and the support because we haven't figured out that role yet.
Yeah. As Krista said, I think the way to balance where I'm struggling is depending on how your IT is set up, and if it's within the library or if it's central IT that helps. Sorry, it's really close. Support library initiatives is when do IT projects differ from library projects, and you know, and depending on how you're set up in that sense. And I think the transparency that Krista talks about is really important because it's hard to see the big picture and how everything kind of melds together and is each separate pieces of this big pie if people don't actually really know what's going on behind the scenes. So, I mean, opening up your ticketing system is, I think, a bold move, but a good move to see, like, hey, guess what we do? Like, yes, your ticket is sitting there, but we also have 45 other things that people have asked us to do, and getting that understanding where IT sits, and it's being on the side and not being involved, and where do you decide that your projects are different from the greater organization? Leaving it as Chris did, you know, with a question. Like, I don't know. So, I don't think that's going to work because I'm not. So, next question. How can cultural differences between non-library IT departments and the library be tackled or overcome?
So I've thought about changing culture in the past. I've tried changing culture. I don't recommend it. You have to start with smaller goals. You don't aim to change a culture. But you can try to reduce the differences. And I think I have heard of talks. I think, what was it? It was something ridiculous like IT is from Mars and librarians are from Venus kind of thing, where they're, you know, talking at crosstalk and we all have jargon, and are we actually able to understand each other? But I think we can do more than that. And I think part of the problem is that we do love silos. Libraries love silos. Heaven forbid we talk with each other and get involved. And I think we need to kind of break those silos down. And again, I can't stress enough how important transparency is in all of this. I think because we are seeing IT expand out into new areas, particularly in digital scholarship, so you're getting digital humanities, you're getting all sorts of people who have an interest in technology but don't necessarily have the background in it, that we can start doing some inclusion on new things. And when we work together on something, we can take those opportunities to start educating each other. So I think we can we use those tech projects, for example, digital humanities projects, but we can also do things like include tech staff on general library committees. Most of my staff is not terribly involved in a lot of the committees in the library. There's an opportunity there to get them involved, to help them understand more about the broader goals and visions of the library as a whole if we start including them in all the committees, not just only the tech projects. I think a common language is important. I don't know if we're there yet, and I'm not entirely sure how we'll get there. But we do have things like metadata. There's a lot of interest in metadata now because of digital scholarship, cataloging metadata. We have a common language that maybe we can start building there. And even talking with my staff, I'm finding that there are little things that we can overlook that we don't realize can make a bigger difference in helping break down, again, those silos and those cultural differences. For example, I was talking with my staff the other day and offering to, maybe do a session on some of the bigger ideas of libraries. And the thing that they wanted was a staff directory with pictures, because they do a lot of work at their desk when they have to go troubleshoot. They don't know everybody in the library, and they feel uncomfortable. That's a little thing that we can do, helping them get comfortable with the rest of the people in the library, and hopefully that will lead to breaking down some of those cultural differences.
Leading off of that, the pictures, that's great, but also maybe, I know it, coming from IT looking into the library, like I know public services, and I know tech services, and I know who's dealing with our cataloging, and but in the reverse, it seems like everybody's an IT person. It's like, but they you don't know their individual roles. And so maybe working to include that, like, hey, this person is actually the one that's going to support maybe your server spin-ups, but this person actually deals with any of your front-end problems. And that might be something, that extra bit of information, and maybe that forces us to look at our individual departments and just figure out, okay, who is actually doing everything? Do we have 5 people who can do all things and we don't actually have this focus? And maybe force us to answer those questions that we haven't in the past. So that's another thing that can kind of overcome those barriers of not knowing.
There's a phrase, right? Seeing how the sausage is made, and I think both Krista and Whitni have hit on some interesting things. One is and what Gillian was saying earlier, one is we're all technology people now. We can't get away from it. A few years ago, I started talking a lot about librarians and library staff learning to code. And at the time, a lot of that was picking up a skill that would be useful in libraries. But even, I've done some coding workshops at U of A, and even just at the level of understanding a little bit more when we set up a web form, when the IT department sets up a web form, what are the pieces that are going into that? And just having a better sense, even if you're not working in a technology area, having a better sense of how all of those bits and pieces work together. On the kind of flip side of that, in our discovery project, we use GitHub, and for the first year or so, that was really just an internal IT tool. The developers and the sysadmins were working in it, but no one else was. And then at a certain point, we had our metadata team create accounts in GitHub, and we had a team of public service assistants, catalogers, public service managers, other frontline people set up GitHub accounts. They never worked in GitHub before, added them as collaborators to the project, and told them to open an issue for anything that they found. And we would start to have discussions within GitHub on the issues that they opened, tagging people in other projects who might be relevant to the discussion. And what we found was, on the one hand, that helped a lot with managing the work that we needed to go through for the project, but it really gave all of the public service people a much better sense of how is the project organized? How is IT structured behind the scenes? What is the work that we're actually doing? Who individually is actually doing each piece of the work? And so I think there's a lot of kind of communication and democratization, if you like, of technology and technology work that's kind of daily grind stuff, but that helps over time to break down the silos, and possibly at some point might help to allowing IT culture to benefit from public service culture and public service culture to benefit from IT culture.
I think the only thing I would add to that, I think the really practical suggestions are all things that we're working on, and I think mixing people up in the sense of we do a lot of stuff by committees, way too much, and I'm not sure why we drive all our technology by committees, but that being said, mixing up the people on those committees, it gets people out of the department and doing different things. When we talk about culture, what's really interesting I find outside of IT is that as librarians or library workers, I feel like we often conflate our values with our culture. So our values of customer service becomes a culture of a reference desk, sort of the obvious example. But how you express your values is really part of your culture. And I think we need to sort of take a step back on all sides and say, okay, like this is our value. This is how we're expressing it. We can move how we express it and still have that value. And I think, though, if we start expressing those values in our technology, everybody's work becomes a lot harder. Better, but harder. So I think that there's some ramifications of doing that, but I think we need to sort of break down that culture from the values that we're trying to express.
Okay, we'll move on. Question 3, I think, maybe if I, yeah. How can library departments make informed decisions about when or whether to bring IT into their projects and service plans?
I think I said I'd take the lead on this one. It's a difficult one to answer. It's really subject to your institutional context, like all the things. How siloed are your departments? How does communication normally work? What is the technology bench strength? What kind of technology are we hosting? Are we installing? All kinds of questions. But I think the very obvious answer is that bringing IT into projects, IT needs to know about projects. And that sort of appropriate communication. It sounds simple, but there's complexity here, and I usually use, I'm sorry, I'm going to use LibGuides. LibGuides to me is an interesting example where almost all of it, the places that I've seen it, it's been driven out of public services. And I get the sense that a lot of librarians don't see it as a piece of technology. They don't see it as something that IT has a big part in, if any. It's something you pay for, it's up, and you're good. Which is the beauty of it, but it's a really interesting one where it's like, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of that sort of communication? I think a very practical first step in terms of a technology unit is to give sort of case studies or give communication about what tech support looks like. So if you want to do X, here's when you should bring us in, here's why it's important, here's what we can do for you. I always look at, I think McMaster, John, where you work, your little flowcharts about service. And that's for an external audience, but those are so useful. I'll tweet out the link after. Mapping those to kind of an internal audience would be very useful. Like, this is what we do for you, this is how we do it, and this is when we can really work with you on it. And I think the difficulty there, of course, is setting those priorities. Once you open up communication, improve communication, you generally increase your workload. So as you do things better, it's kind of like the liaison trouble. The better you are at liaison, the more work you have to do. So I think that the whole organization needs to be a part of that priority setting, not just the two departments involved, because sometimes there's short-term opportunities versus long-term. You've got sort of the long-term things, the strategy versus core business versus research. All of those things need to have sort of somehow more than just the sort of direct actors involved in making those kind of decisions and setting that priority. And again, the sort of transparency around that.
I guess I'll jump in. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record because I think it consistently boils down to communication and transparency. Out of curiosity, how many of you in your libraries does your IT department, or any department for that matter, give like maybe a once a term or a monthly session to the library to let them know what you're doing? Anybody? One
hand.
Two.
Two.
Yeah.
Maybe two.
If we start talking about what we're doing, people will have a better understanding of what kinds of things we can offer and when to bring us in. We can do a session. So you're thinking about doing something. When should you talk to us? I mean, that's a session you could do in an hour. And through that communication and transparency, you can make those informed decisions. I'm finding sometimes you're forced into new partnerships. If you're understaffed, sometimes you have to look elsewhere. That's not necessarily a bad thing. As I've said before, never let a good crisis go to waste. we're looking at new things, new ways of doing things. And I think, sometimes it isn't the answer that we want, but we can make it work. So it's finding that balance between partnership, the loss of control, and the domain, or the empire building.
I'm actually going to flip the question around a little bit and think for a second about how can library IT, as a department of a larger organization, drive this, right? Not how do we put the onus necessarily on public service departments or liaison departments to contact us, but how do we make sure that we're front of their mind when they start thinking of a project. I think we probably, all of us who work in library systems departments, have had the experience of someone phoning us asking for, a database-driven website for a conference they're putting together, and they need it tomorrow. And they didn't know that this would require lead time on our part. This would require resource management, a whole bunch of things. But the flip side is also true. How many times have projects arisen in IT where we think, well, it's just, we're just going to put this website up, or we're just going to put together Archivematica's Atom, and we're going to throw it up and everybody will be happy. And then it comes as a complete surprise to anyone in public service who's actually going to have to deal with the front-facing repercussions of this service. And so I think for people who work in IT to think about both of those cases, think about the times that that's happened, and how do we actually get around to rectifying some of that. One of the things that we do at U of A is on our Public Service Council, which is the committee of all of the public service managers for all of the branches, we always have IT representation. Interestingly, we have representation from the traditional systems department, but we don't have representation from the digital initiatives department, which handles things like digital scholarship. So, part of that breaks down there. The other thing that I found is you need to be present. You have to be out of your office. You have to be presenting. You have to be going to the different units and talking about initiatives that are in IT. They'll start to remember who you are when you're the guy who comes around talking about a blacklight implementation, or you're the guy coming around talking about changes to policy or procedure or workflow around technology. So those are things that we can do from inside a systems department, which might help keep us on the radar, which, without putting the onus of cultural change directly on public service departments, helps to sort of bring some of this about.
Really don't have much more to add. It was funny that you flipped it, Sam, because I was actually pulling the mic to do the same thing. You just beat me. So, yeah. Anybody have anything further they want to add? Okay, we'll move on to question 4. How can IT lead professional development or capacity building in technology? I think that's, yeah.
Okay.
Sam?
I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about this and then open it up to everybody else. My answer to this, I think, always starts with why do we want to do that? Why do we want to develop, to sort of lead or create professional development opportunities around technology in the library? And I think we've covered a lot of these points already. On the one hand, there's a sort of terminology, understanding how the sausage is made piece, which I think more and more all library staff need to understand, whether they feel like it or not. As libraries become more and more and more technology focused, and you're dealing with more and more and more sophisticated pieces of technologies that are outwardly aimed, I think that requirement becomes more important. But also that question of being able to translate between levels. How do we talk to technology vendors? How do we talk to sysadmins? The technology vendor piece is really interesting because our relationship with technology vendors really arose in a period when libraries were, even more than they are now, resistant to the rapid pace of technological change, right? Automation in the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And so our relationship with vendors quite often happens through librarians who may not be particularly technical, don't necessarily have the language to talk about technical issues with a technology vendor. And we can often get ourselves into not great positions, to put it mildly, with respect to technology vendors. Our technology ecosystem between proprietary, vendor-driven solutions and open source, one of the reasons why that's still a contentious thing is that our relationship with technology vendors is constrained. And I think one of the reasons it's constrained is that we don't always have the language or the understanding across the board to be able to talk to vendors. Rise of digital humanities, we need to collaborate. We need to get out of the library and talk to more and more people.
Stealing my notes.
Yeah.
I think where I'd really like to see training go is sort of beyond training and more context building. So I pretty consistently ask the question, why? What is the issue here? Why is it like this? Why is it like that? And oftentimes I'm doing that gut check with system staff and saying, like, is that the crux? Because I think that's the crux. Or I think that's really bad. Am I right? Is that the part that's really bad? And so getting to that point where, particularly as an administrator, I can understand the issues and understand where the issues lie in the landscape without having the deep technical training. And I think to a certain extent, everybody can benefit from that. Again, you can see how the sausage is made, not be able to make the sausage, but understand why it's awesome. As sort of that context building, and I find that most of the time, if not all of the time when we fail at projects is because we haven't spent the time figuring out that we have a shared context, that we're doing the same thing. So I'd like to see more of that kind of training. And I'd like to see the reverse too. Like you were saying, I can't remember which one, with system staff getting the context of other library work too.
Yeah. So I think, I don't like microphones. And you totally threw my train of thought. The training in opening up IT to libraries, we talk a lot about, I feel like, as we've been discussing, there's been a lot of action to be on the IT side to come into the library, and I think it might be better for us to open up IT and invite, do IT style type of presentations that might not have, they'll have a direct relation to the library, but it may not be discovery layer work, or it may not be metadata work, but it's something that is, and doing that sort of open up the doors and inviting or having them come see the other side. That it's not, that as librarians we need to take that initiative to ask the questions why, to inquire, something that might appear as a high priority item for me, but ends up being, number 10 on the list. Why? So I can get a better understanding. We need to take that initiative to find out, and as on the IT end, we need to be willing to teach, take that opportunity. When that question is asked, that's kind of actually my favorite question. When I was working in academia, anytime I would go in and troubleshoot something, anytime someone would say, well, I don't understand, or why are you doing that, rather than just saying, okay, it's fixed and go on my way, explain the process. It does two things. It teaches them something that they could probably solve a problem on their own, and if they come to me, then I know it's not, oh, this setting needs to be unchecked, that it is actually probably more of a problem that I needed to be involved in, and that my time doesn't get wasted. But also, I'm now viewed as somebody who is not trying to hide stuff or have this control over everything and being this is my thing, this is what I do, opening it up and being more welcoming, because I find that tends to be, it's oh, that's IT, even though it's library, it's oh, that's an IT thing and that's a library thing, where it needs to be much more integrated in, and I don't think we're doing as good of a job as we think we are. And so some ideas around that.
I don't really have too much more to add to it. But for me, this question, it was less about professional development and capacity building, but more about learning opportunities. We've had the year of code and, the push for everybody must learn to code. Everybody must know it. Everybody must be an expert in it. It's not true. Understanding some fundamentals may be useful in, bridging that jargon. But we don't all need to be experts in IT. That's why we have an IT department. But there are learning opportunities that present themselves more than a professional development opportunity. And I think where we're going to see that is particularly in some of these digital humanities projects where we do have a lot of interest from people who aren't in tech. And I think that some of the projects that we're seeing, the digital preservation, the digital showcases that are coming out of unique collections, there's a learning opportunity there as we're partnering with more people who aren't necessarily only in the library, but across campus even. So we're working with faculty in new ways. We might even be working with campus IT in new ways as we find the best way to support some of these larger projects, which we would love to be able to do, but may not have the capacity within the library to do it. So for me, it's more about learning opportunities and leveraging those rather than actually having a professional development plan or a capacity building plan.
The one thing I think I had that I just sort of thought about is what IT workers, particularly in libraries, tend to be better at than any of the rest of us is requirements building, because that's such a functional part of technology. But I think that would be a useful expertise to spread widely. So if you are building requirements for something non-technical, having an IT person leading that discussion will probably get you further because they have that experience. So it's not just about technology, but it's about sort of the strengths that they bring beyond that I think we don't always think about in that way. That would be a useful thing beyond project management, which obviously is a really helpful thing.
Question 5, whatever, next question. Where would you like to see your library and IT integration in 5 years? We kind of laughed when we brought this question up because, it's that inevitable, annoying interview question. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? But, I was thinking about it, and it's like, currently, I do a lot of criticizing about this IT integration to libraries. In some institutions, I'm hearing more and more, are really doing a pretty decent job of bringing IT in and opening it up so it's not this, so there's a lot of collaboration happening. And where would, in my current situation, where do I want to see the library and the integration with IT? And I think we currently view, or how our organization is set up is we have central IT, and they do most of the, if we want to do something different, we kind of have to pass it through them. Working in a corporate world, it's all about security, and more so than just general security. And I think where I would like to see us is that when we bring something up, we're not dreading having to talk to corporate IT because we think, they're just going to say no. That instead it's going to be this question of why, and it's going to become a discussion. And that's kind of, yes, I would like that to happen in the next year or 2 years, but I'm putting my goals as something that I can actually maybe accomplish. And that when we do bring up these questions or bringing them into projects, that it's not like, I don't have time for you, like, this is not any of interest or importance on IT's end, that it's like, okay, well, why do we need to do it this way? That they have a little bit more of an interest and an understanding of what our stake is within the organization. So, that's kind of my answer to that question.
This one's I don't know that I want to answer this question because I think it'll take longer than 5 years, but where I would like to see libraries is that we have embedded what we feel are core library values in our technology and in our services, and that there isn't an othering of those two things, that there is an integration that is understanding that I do firmly believe, particularly academic libraries, our best value proposition right now will be the technology we can develop, other than being sort of a buyer's club for commercial interests. And to shift that, we need to intentionally integrate IT into everything we do and sort of not have it on the side or as a support. But that will take longer than 5 years.
I'm not sure. I think kind of going off of what Gillian said, it goes to Chris's talk this morning, where we were talking about using open source to build systems that don't have those inherent biases in them. And I would love to see us do more in that area. How? Not sure. But I think that Chris raised a really good point with that, and that is one of our strengths, that we could be that, fill that gap, and make things more equitable, and think in a more social justice way when it comes to our technology. So I'd love to see us do a lot more in that area, and I thank Chris for bringing that up. My big thing is I think I'd like to see it staffed, regardless. I know, and for everybody, I think we could all use more people. And I think if we build up those communications and those transparencies, we can work on building those partnerships. And so I'd like to see us integrated in a more cohesive way, I think.
I want to just follow up on a part that you said, the staffed part. Thinking about it, I mean, going beyond the scope, like, is that staffing something, and in my mind, I think yes, something that can be incorporated with current library staff, library non-IT staff that might have an interest? Is that something, I mean, I think, in my opinion, that's something that we should aim for, is that it shouldn't be like, let's staff IT, which, yes, we maybe more departments need more staff in it, yours given the case. But can we start cross-training and, doing that? Something to think about down the line. Because if the technology is going to continue the way it is, I feel that it'll be in our benefit and those that get cross-trained also. And it would be great to cross-train IT into libraries. I think, that's a discussion I've had many times is, would you rather be an IT person that comes into, what do you think would be easier, IT coming into libraries or a librarian going into IT? And there is a pretty decent discussion that appears with that, but.
I think, realistically, I agree with the staffed piece. Idealistically, I would like to see library IT disappear. I think that if we could, over the next 5 years, go, and this is unrealistic, but if we could go all in on automation, all in on infrastructure as code and infrastructure as a service, go all in on automatic code generation, automate as much as we possibly could, and then have software services that could be driven without mediation by anyone in the library or anyone in the user group, students, faculty, members of the public if you're a public library, with little to no mediation on the part of IT staff. You'd always have to have a little bit. I think that would be great. I think that would handle the integration piece. I think that would handle the how do you balance IT projects and non-IT projects piece. Listening this morning to what UNB's been working on, and at U of A, we're a little bit down that road, but we're nowhere near as far as they are, and I would love to see us keep going down that route. Have everything open source, have everything accessible, have everything flexible, but really be able, ideally, to take most of library IT away. Repurpose those people, have them working in other units of the library. I think in 5 years, sure, let's do that.
Yeah, we started a little early, so that kind of concluded the questions that we wanted to bring in, sort of. But now we're going to open it up to you guys to ask questions. So be kind.
But if we've sorted it all for you and you're great, that's fine too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I took a few notes while you were addressing each of the questions. So I have more comments than questions, or perhaps my comments will generate questions and we'll have a conversation. To give you a bit of context, I'm also a web services librarian, but I have had some subject responsibilities. We have about 35 professional librarians, including about 5 systems librarians. So I'm in IT, but I'm communicating also with the public services librarians. And we do it in a very informal way. And I think we've had some successes. You know, it's not perfect, but I think the key there is informal, because I'll report to them about what we're doing in systems. And anytime I can give a sneak peek, like a screenshot of something, or I can demystify something that we're working on, give a little show and tell, say why this is important, say why I'm excited about it, and get them excited about it, I think that really helps. So it's really quite informal. We're not broadcasting information. We don't have like a monthly newsletter or something like that. It's really just talking to the people who talk most to other people so that the message gets communicated. And I think it's also too, like, I try to champion my systems people to other people who may not know what they're doing. And I also will, I have people who I know in the university IT, and I take an interest in what they're doing, and then I champion them with the library. So I'm working kind of behind the scenes so that everybody can value each other also. Because sometimes, one thing too I like to do is demystify the technology. Because if you kind of know all the work that goes into things, and sometimes there's a lot of work, especially maintaining systems, that is not really visibly producing anything new, but is really optimizing what we're doing. That is very important. Also, to put on your point about the integration with university IT, I fought that and won in 2014. I think it's safe to say now that I won, though it wasn't immediately apparent back then. So if anyone wants to talk about strategies there, I'm happy to. So yeah, thanks again. It's really interesting to talk about these topics. It's important.
Those are some really great points. And I just want to follow up on one thing, which is I think the informality piece is really important. Chris Borg talked this morning about really listening to people. And I think that a lot of our mechanisms and hierarchies of communication, especially in universities, go against that. Right, they allow for very formalized one-way communication. It's broadcast. It doesn't sink in. So I think the more informal communication we can have at this point, the better. I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, more of a conversation, less of a, speech, talk.
I know that you guys know this because I complain about it on Twitter sometimes, but librarians do a lot of professional hand-wringing about the nature of the position, what it means to be a librarian. And listening to this talk, I hear a lot of conversation about how librarians need to be better at IT, librarians need to pay more attention, library staff needs to pay more attention. But one of the things I think that we're really bad at remembering is that a lot of the developers who work for us are working for a major discount to do good work for us. They can make way more money in private. And we're lucky to have them. It's sort of a home team discount that we get for good people. And I know there's certain things like job security and those things that factor into it. Startups come and go, and our developers stick around basically because they're good people. So I guess I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of bridge the gap in a labor way, because I know sometimes librarians get frustrated when people seem to be getting on their turf. Like the idea of having IT people in library departments is beautiful, but I know librarians can also be sort of turfy about who's on their ground, the credentials. Are you or are you not a librarian? Do you have the letters? What are the challenges you guys see in that sort of labor-based problem?
Who wants to?
I said be kind.
Yeah, I think that there's several problems to unpack there. One is sort of the value universities put on this kind of labor. It's not just libraries. I mean, generally we have pay scales that go across universities. I can't speak for other sectors. And I don't know that that value has seeped in of technology into the pay scales that we do have. And by and large, you're right. The people that we have sticking around are because there's interesting work. They like the values. They like the work. And to do that, we have to give them interesting work. And I think that's sometimes where we stumble a little bit is nobody wants to like work with a terrible commercial system all the time doing, I don't know, the things that the librarians think are important. I can't think of an analogy right now. Yes, loading records. And I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement that there is interesting work we could be doing. That said, I do see that there's going to continue to be silos, just like there is between librarians and library workers, between departments. And it really is, there's the vertical silos and there is still the horizontal silos, and we have work to do to break those down. I'd like to see that happen on sort of a national consortial. I think that's one way to do it is, you're going to have sort of established hierarchies in institutions that are going to be easier to break down sort of cross-institutionally. So looking at consortial committees, looking at national committees, seeing who we put on those committees, I think is important, so that your associate chief librarian isn't on every committee that really shouldn't be. So I sit on a lot of committees where I have experts within my institution. And I think it's ridiculous that I sit on them when I have those experts and those are the ones that should be at the table. So I think that's one thing I might try.
One of the things, I'm gonna put on my red librarian hat for a sec. One of the things that's important to remember is that credentialism and turfiness and protection of position and status is imposed on us by the logic of the economic system. In Canada, we primarily, especially in universities, we primarily work within unionized environments where all of that stuff, collective agreements at one level are there to protect all of us who are library workers, but at another level are there to make it very, very difficult for anyone to change the status quo within an organization. So having said that, I think that one of the things that we need to do as librarians and as library workers is remember that we're all workers in general. And when it comes time to open up collective agreements both on the librarian side and the staff side, is to work, if we can, very closely with support staff unions, for example, agitate with them, try to help to bring their positions up more in line with ours. The classic Marxist view is that through those kinds of struggles, we will become aware of our own positions within the economic system. And so one of the ways to challenge credentialism and turfiness and things like that is precisely to get involved in those kinds of struggles. It's not easy. The system is designed to prevent us doing that, but that's one possible answer to that.
We're like on a mind meld because what he said.
Thank you all for having this conversation in the open. It was really helpful. I think it was Krista or Sam was talking about, I can't remember the last time the strategic initiative kind of came out of my shop or my group. And I wondered if the panel could talk a little bit about competing priorities and how those get, and what I'm getting at here is I have a constituent, or we work with constituents that not everybody is created equal within our organization. That is, if an administrator or a dean comes to me and said, make this IR happen, somehow that becomes a bigger priority than the reference librarian reaching out to Sam saying, can I have a database-backed website? So could you just talk a bit about how do you work to address those priorities and keep them?
I don't know if everybody heard the question. I'm not sure. How do we deal with priorities when they come through? For example, Dean comes in and says this IR needs to happen. What happens to all the other projects that I've been working on, and how do you handle that? One of the things that the tactics that I've been fortunate enough, not everybody's in a situation where you can do this, but I come back and I say, okay, we can do this, but by making this priority, then this, and this get put on the back burner. Are you okay with that? So that they're aware that we have these other projects that have been going on. And sometimes I have had my dean come and say, well, actually, because some of those projects were other things that they came in and said, this needs to be done right now. And they more or less think it's going to happen with a flick of a button, and it doesn't. But coming back and saying, that's fine, I'll put this on because what you say needs to go, but we have X, Y, and Z that are also going to be put back, and if you're okay with that, then we'll go forward and do it. But it's a pushback. It's questioning, is this actually the real priority that we need to bring up, or is it something that needs to be brought into the top priority, but you need to finish, let's work on A and B first. That's kind of something that I've done.
This is something I'm struggling with because we are finding ourselves in a situation where we really have to set priorities. We have to stick to them. And it's a combination of communication and education. If the dean came with a project and said it has to be done now, you have to use that as a learning opportunity to explain the complexity of that project and actually put it in context for how long that's going to take and what it actually means to the people in your department and what that's going to do to your workload. I think it's also important, and again, this is kind of my context. I have an AULIT, and I would need that person to have my back and support me when I say, that's not possible, or yes, but. So I think there needs to be support from another administrator. I think there needs to be education in what it is we're doing and how much it takes. It's hard, and I have not managed. I say yes more than I should, most likely. And that will hopefully, a skill that you develop over time. Because there are way too many competing priorities, and it's hard, and I don't have a definitive answer.
When the UNB presentation was going on this morning, one of the questions I had was, how did they convince admin that, their bosses or the university admin, the library admins, that there was a problem serious enough to declare bankruptcy? One of the issues that I find is that people at the administrative level, if they're divorced from the work, they don't recognize when conflicting priorities are a problem. So quite often when I ask someone, what are the priorities here, I get, everything's a priority. Well, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So somehow I think working on, working upstream or working upwardly to help to try and get administrators and deans and people like that recognize that's not conducive to sustainable technology. That's not conducive to good work. A dean dropping a project on you right away, and then that floats to the priority list and you put everything on the back burner isn't a good way to manage your projects. But that's a long-term, slow thing. It's, I think part of the informality question, applies horizontally, it applies going down, but it also applies going up, right? You have to have those conversations with your admin and your managers and try to get them to understand that.
I think there's a few thoughts I have, actually. One is, this comes from the top down as part of our library culture again, is that we say yes as a form of customer service. And that's not the best way necessarily to provide customer service, is constantly agreeing to things rather than saying, this is what we're good at, this is what we can do. So a lot of times it sort of comes down from above like that, because your dean's trying to make friends with the dean of science. Your dean is seeing a win or seeing an opportunity. Those are always going to happen. I think aspirationally, you build enough give in your organization to take on some of these things. You're not always going to have the staff to do it, but if people are working 100% of the time, then there is no give for these kind of opportunities that come up. The other thing from my perspective, what I'd like to hear back is if I come to you with like, yeah, we're doing this because I see this and I know you got a million other things to do, but this one's going right to the top of the list. A, yes, tell me what that is going to impact, but B, tell me what you need to get it done. And sometimes I don't hear that back either. It's like, I know I'm putting a ton on you. What do you need? What can I do? And oftentimes the answer is like, I don't really know, maybe nothing. And I'm like, I know there's something. So I think some of those things, and again, going back to if you have strategic plans, is it in there? If 9 out of 10 projects you've done this year aren't in your plan, then your plan's wrong. or your work is wrong. One of those two things is happening. There's always going to be a little bit of difference, but yeah, there's really, I think, what we need to hear back from my perspective is a better understanding, like Krista was saying, but also like, okay, can I get your resources? What can I do?
I think that's a very good place to end. I'll ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.